In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on cognizance as it pertains to distinctions within the overarching personality characteristics urgency and or meditativeness and or orderliness, each meaningful to satisfy certain relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful, essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, associated with monitoring of changes within one's internal and or external conditions that are most appropriate to identify the certain changes within one's desire to satisfy certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs with certain changes in feelings and or thought processes, including fatigue, most distinct from okayness, that's most related to the changes within certain pangs and or discomforts of deprivations within needs. Not necessarily the recognition of fatigue and or other areas of one's consciousness experiences that are meaningful to identify changes within information processing and or the meaningful information processing that's appropriate to navigate certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs. Be it that one is engaging more orderliness, one is able to organize information processes within their direct perception that's more likely to result in more meaningful satisfactions of certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, optimizing the intercategorical and or intracategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies within cognizant direct perceptions of the information processes. One is organizing often thematically or within what is the meaningful similarities that allow for, firstly, assortments, meaning that there are more shallow categorical combinations with more vague connections in terms of the directly and or indirectly related intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties one may detail out in terms of the complexity to engage more orderly and or optimizing effectivenesses and or efficiencies within the intracategoricals and or the connections within the intercategoricals, existingly connecting the distinct assortments into more refined categoricals, no longer necessarily assortments, that are meaningful to engage the optimization of the effectivenesses and or efficiencies within one's perspectival processing of complex sets of meaningful information that are more ingestible, compared to the opposite polarity of orderliness, be it disorderliness, that is more difficult to navigate complexity, resulting in more intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies more likely to result in distress, meaning that individuals have more difficulty satisfying certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs within more disorderly thinking processes, compared to urgency that's most related to the prioritization of certain meaningful information within one's direct perception that is meaningful to constitute what exactly the relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful underlying essential psychological needs are within distinct situations, within the necessitation of certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs that one is more sensitive to within conscious processes, engaging the executive functioning in terms of the risk and or benefit with satisfying certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs over others to the exclusion of those needs in terms of the appropriate and or relevant and or meaningful instead of the irrelevant and or inappropriate and or meaningless harmful essential and or necessitated psychological needs, as well to the appropriate proportion of satisfaction, meaning that one avoids under and or oversleeping to constitute the appropriate essential and or necessitated underlying psychological need satisfaction, and or may satisfy the appropriate conditions to experience the appropriate sexual desire satisfactions, instead of engaging more maladaptive, inappropriate misconducts and or mistaken, harmful approaches to satisfying sexual desire, be it one is engaging in more of a dysfunctional porn addiction, resulting in more sexual dysfunction than meaningful sexual desire satisfaction. One may instead visualize in terms of engaging more meaningful sexual fantasies calibrated to an individual one may desire to be with, and is more likely to engage more healthy psychological functioning masturbation that is appropriate to satisfy one's sexual desire, instead of counterproductive, harmful dysfunctions within engaging a harmful porn addiction. Meaning that one is cognizant of the risks and or benefits engaging that executive functioning, and or the consequences of the certain consequence to one's volitions and or conducts that are meaningful to result in more positive outcomes, compared to the other personality characteristics most associated with cognizance, involving meditativeness, that's most associated with the elaborations within one's information processing of what's meaningful to satisfy certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs within more deliberate conscious navigations, instead of more mindlessness, the opposite polarity of meditativeness. Meditativeness is more likely to cultivate meaningfulness processes within those pursuits of certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological need satisfactions, meaning there are elaborations of what's meaningful to identify and or appropriately recognize what one needs to in terms of the step-by-step approach to satisfying certain relevant and or meaningful and or appropriate essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, engaging more healthy psychological functioning, and ultimately optimizing more positive subjective well-being within the future-oriented pursuit of certain personal goals and or life goals. One satisfies the appropriate, relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful underlying essential and or necessitated psychological needs that optimize healthy psychological functioning domain-specific to those pursuits. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one and can move this up to that.